Prohibition may have made alcohol illegal, but that doesn't mean that people still wouldn't find some way to drink it. Bootleggers were people who illegally made and sold alcohol during this time. In the 1920s era, this was big business. Before, saloon runners may have made a decent living. However, with the 18th Amendment in effect, bootleggers could make a lot of money selling drinks illegally, and since alcohol was illegal and hard to come by, it was in a higher demand. Since the law was not taken too seriously, some cities boasted that they were one of the wettest cities, which means they had the most alcohol. One famous bootlegger was a man named George Remus. Living in Cincinnati, he made a $5 million fortune off of the bootlegging business. He was a lawyer who noticed his clients were making a lot of money selling alcohol. He used to be a pharmacist, so he sold his alcohol at his pharmacies. One time at a party, he was so rich that he gave all the female guests brand new cars. Diamond watches were given to the men. When he eventually was put in jail, his wife tried to hide his money and paid to get him killed. That didn't work, and when Remus did finally get out, he shot his wife in front of her daughter. But the court let him out off of charges of temporary insanity. Alcohol was not always from the United States. Sometimes it was shipped over from other countries where alcohol was not illegal. One main source was between Detroit and Canada, where a lot of alcohol would be imported from. Sometimes people would also make it themselves. This alcohol was called moonshine whiskey or bathtub gin. People would make this stuff secretly, sometimes in their own homes. This could also be very dangerous. Since this alcohol was not made legally, it did not go through the normal process of making sure that it was safe, like it would have in an old legal brewery. People would add too much alcohol into their drinks, which could lead to death by alcohol poisoning. People wouldn't just sit around and drink alcohol in their homes always. For those who didn't want to bother making it themselves, these people could go to places called speakeasies. These were illegal bars that were hidden. These bars started appearing after the 18th Amendment was passed. They were called speakeasies because to get in, you needed a secret code, or a secret knock. One needed to speak easy or quietly to get in and avoid being caught. These places were also known as blind pigs or blind tigers. Those who went to speakeasies were usually upper and middle class people. Both men and women went to speakeasies. Previously, it was frowned upon for a woman to go to a bar, but the thrill of a speakeasy changed that, and it became a normal thing. Inside a speakeasy was not just drinking. One could also find jazz music, dancing, and gambling inside. Speakeasies could be found in various places, sometimes under shops. In a case of a police raid, some were so hidden that the walls could turn and the bar would just appear to go away. Some speakeasy drinks are still enjoyed today. Cocktails came from the 1920s era. Since the taste of the moonshine whiskey wasn't usually very good, people would mix other drinks in with the alcohol to make it taste better. This became very popular and is still so today. Once alcohol was legal again, speakeasies were no longer necessary and would fade off or become normal bars. Bootleggers had to find intricate places where they could brew alcohol and the authorities not be able to find them. While some would do so in their own homes, others would do it at illegal breweries. Other ways people could hide alcohol was in their clothes. People would hide it in their coats or under their dresses. They would strap containers and attach them to their legs. This became a very common thing when going to the speakeasy. Sometimes people would just bring their own alcohol with them instead of buying it at the speakeasy. There were some ways that people would get around the law, however. Getting alcohol for religious purposes was still legal, so people would often claim that the wine they wanted was for sacramental use. During this time, alcohol was thought to have medical purposes, so it was still legal to get alcohol as long as one had a prescription. People would often counterfeit these, and then they would be able to get their alcohol. However, it was usually very easy for someone to convince a doctor to write them a prescription as well. Pharmacies would apply for liquor licenses so that they could give the alcohol. California grape juice was a way people could get legal alcohol as well. If it was allowed to sit and ferment for 60 days, it would become 12% alcohol. Needless to say, during this time, the wine grape industry went up 400%. This also led people to think that homemade fruit drinks did not violate the laws of prohibition. Once the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, bootlegging and speakeasies were not really necessary anymore. However, some of the era's most interesting culture could be found in a speakeasy. Prohibition-related violations were accounted with 65% of all federal court cases during this time. It goes to show that whether alcohol was illegal or not, people in the 1920s were going to drink.
So to sort of build off of that, we're going to discuss the law enforcement aspects of Prohibition, as well as take a look into some of the most infamous mobs and criminals of the 1920s era. The head director of the FBI at the start of the 1920s was a man named William J. Burns, and he appointed Edgar Hoover as the assistant director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and later, when Calvin Coolidge became president, Edgar Hoover became the head director of the FBI. Thanks to Edgar Hoover, the FBI had drastically improved throughout the 1920s. They started to fire their underqualified agents and started formal training courses to make the FBI as strong of an organization as possible. And they also started to keep better, more careful records of criminals throughout the nation. And most states began their own fingerprint collections to better identify criminals within their area. The law that the 18th Amendment had rested on was the Volstead Act, which had created a Prohibition Bureau that was responsible for preventing the transportation of alcohol and maintaining the integrity of Prohibition. However, it was very difficult to patrol over 18,000 miles of coastline to stop alcohol from getting imported. The Bureau only had 15,000 agents who were all very underpaid. The Bureau got very little accomplished, and alcohol remained a problem in our nation. One of the reasons that people disobeyed Prohibition was because after World War II, they really needed something to relieve them of all the stress. Also, for many of the immigrants living in our country at that time, it was a part of everyday life in their homelands to drink alcohol. But the main reason why Prohibition was so hard to enforce was because, for most, alcohol was just too great of a thing to sacrifice. So, many people were able to use that to their advantage. One of the most famous mobs of the 1920s was a group of Jewish immigrants from Russia who were known as the Purple Gang. It is said that they had received this name because purple was known as being the color of bad meat. Their claim to fame is that they would steal liquor from other gangs and mobs that were more powerful than they were, and instead of just bootlegging liquor, they would actually hijack it. Throughout this decade, the Purple Gang had completely controlled the liquor and drug trade of Detroit. The leaders of this gang were named Abe and Ray Bernstein. Another interesting thing about the Purple Gang is that they were referenced to in Elvis Presley's Jailhouse Rock. Here's the line coming up right now. The whole rhythm section was the Purple Gang. This is Al Capone. Well, actually, he liked to be called Big Fellow. He quit school just after 6th grade. However, he was still able to make $60 million a year just off of the bootlegging industry. After he quit school, he was invited to join a gang by Johnny Torrio, the gang's leader. No one had done a better job at violating the Prohibition laws than Al Capone. He's known for illegal alcohol producing and distributing lots and lots of liquor and beer. He had ran a chain of over 10,000 speakeasies across several states in the Midwest. But surprisingly, he was never arrested for being a bootlegger, but rather he went to jail in 1931 for tax evasion. Another famous bootlegger of this time was Roy Olmsted, who ironically was a police officer and a bootlegger all at once. As a matter of fact, his own arrest had gotten him fired from the police squad. But still, he was able to bring in $200,000 a month by bootlegging 200 cases of Canadian whiskey daily. However, undercover agents were hired to investigate, and they had raided his home and obtained evidence of his bootlegging. And just like Al Capone, rather than being arrested for Prohibition purposes, he was arrested for tax evasion in 1926. The bootleggers and rum runners of the 1920s had heavily relied on countries such as Canada, the West Indies, and Cuba to supply them the alcohol that they needed. The St. Clair River, which had flowed between Michigan and Canada, had provided 75% of the nation's liquor. Ontario had 45 distilleries and breweries that the bootleggers could utilize. Distilling, manufacturing, and transporting alcohol, basically disobeying the 18th Amendment to our Constitution, had become the second biggest business in Detroit, bringing in $250 million each year in the 1920s. On the West Coast, there was an organization called the Seattle Police Dry Squad, whose purpose was to defend the Prohibition laws and arrest anyone who had disobeyed them. But surprisingly, many agents of the Seattle Police Dry Squad were rum runners themselves, and had also gotten arrested along with many of the other gangs and criminals of the Prohibition era. Overall, our country was not very successful in enforcing the Prohibition laws, and that had a great impact on the American culture of the Roaring Twenties.